Barry's podcast resonated a lot with people, like the idea of the guilt that comes with the money. And then there's like, okay, so let's not money at all. Instead of saying, no, I see you. I see your incredible value. And I'm demanding of you. There's no reason you can't go through Likud Zichas. There's no reason you can't go through Shas. There's no reason that you can't learn Liyuna. Whatever it is that your skills are, there's no reason you can't go to take over a business and take it over. You can't go do a shlichus. I see you and I hold you accountable for the chushim that you have. You could do so much more. I'll be honest, for me, if I had a mashpia like that would see me, my Mailos and Chesenis, and hold me to account, that would be a gift.
Welcome to Homesick for Lubavitch, a podcast where we explore Lubavitch identity in the year 2024. My name is Bosi Avtzon, and I will be your host. Let's begin. Alrighty, we are here with Rabbi Levi Avtzon, currently Rabbi and Shliach in Johannesburg, South Africa. What's the name of your shul?
Linksfield Shul. It's an Ashkenaz shul.
The Linksfield Shul in Johannesburg, South Africa. He grew up in Crown Heights, in fact, in this home. And we are now in the basement of the home, in the bunker, which makes me as a Shem Tov very, very, very comfortable. This is where I flourish.
The bunkers.
Yeah. And for anybody who is concerned that we're having too many Avtzons on the podcast, you can rest assured that there are many more. So we are not going. That problem will persist indefinitely. There's about 100 of us, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'd like to get to that at some point. I know that you've done a lot of research on our grandparents, on
fascinating story.
Rebbe and Chen Avtzon, and I think that'd be very interesting to get to.
Especially after in a previous episode you said that you have no ancestors in Neville.
Yes.
And that triggered a lot of Avtzons.
Yeah, I did say that I have no connection to Neville. Yeah, I don't know. My father never mentioned it. I mean, I guess in Hong Kong, that's not like. It's not a distinguishing factor. Like, we're from Neville. I mean, like...
Sure, there's a Crown Heights today. I'm not sure it says much either. But
no, okay. but I'm saying, like, you're Barimzich in Hong Kong, you're from Neville. Yeah. I think that was a subject that was covered already with your brother, with Shmuley, the difference of growing up in Hong Kong. But I suppose. I mean, let's start with your story, and then we'll see where it takes us. But let's start with your story. How did you end up in South Africa? How did you end up doing what you're doing? Was it always something that you expected to do?
It's a good question. Grew up here, Crown Heights, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to do shlichus or not. It's actually a very unusual shlichus story, but I basically got married to a South African girl. And I was torn. In other words, shlichus, I didn't grow up with that. I didn't go to those yeshivas with shlichus. And it was an option, but it wasn't necessarily the only option. And I remember I was just sitting in Koilel and I was just plodding. It wasn't going anywhere. And just before after my wedding, I remember standing in 770 talking to a brother-in-law of mine, and we're chatting, and he's like, I don't know who said it, but someone's like, why don't you just move to South Africa and try see what happens? And that idea of just moving to South Africa and just moving into my in-laws, at first glance sounded crazy, but literally it clicked in my head right away. And I was living at the time in Crown and Kingston, so it's a 3-minute walk from 770. By the time I came home, I was convinced it's the right decision. So I came home, I spoke to my wife. I think our firstborn was about to be born, and I said, Chaya, let's move to South Africa. She already had a job lined up. This is like Sivan Tammuz time for next year. That was Sunday. By Tuesday, I had informed my family, her family. We got permission from her parents to move into her home. in Johannesburg, and literally we made a decision. She canceled her job. I canceled whatever things I was doing.
Sounds like she had planted this idea in your head
No,
earlier.
not at all. It was
That's what it sounds
no,
like.
not at all. That's what often people assume. None of her sisters have come back since, and it was totally. When I met her, it was moving to South Africa was b'chlal not an option.
Mm-hmm.
We moved into her parents a few months later after Tishrei, and started from the bottom. Got a job at a shliach, working a few part-time days. Got a job in the local high school, and slowly but surely learned the lay of the land. Which, by the way, a podcast of its own. I believe there's a lot of value in doing shlichus in that way. That you come to a place and the place learns you, and you learn the place.
Right.
And slowly but surely, you find a shlichus that's appropriate to you and your spouse. Rather than sitting in Crown Heights and Kotel, you don't know the place doesn't know you. You get a job with official titles, a dotted line, and then you come to the place and you find out that it's like a shidduch. You're marrying somebody without actually dating.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a broader conversation. The natural instinct is to talk about the politics of shlichus, which deserves a conversation. And just the challenge of landing somewhere and figuring your way out, figuring your way up. Shlichus doesn't have that corporate structure really, and so you're either in or you're out. It's been discussed on this podcast even. Penny and Druzia spoke about it at length. And so, I mean, there's a politics of it, but I think more interesting for me at least is that, the whole model of shlichus, the conception of shlichus is that, and a shliach once put it to me this way. He said, look, shlichus is you make a decision at a young time in your life, you make one important decision, and then you never have to make that kind of decision again.
That was not my journey.
Exactly. But that's the model. That's the mental concept of shlichus is we know, after figuring it out with the powers that be, we know where our shetach is. We know where our city, neighborhood, island, country, continent, depending on how sparse the place is, right? We know that that's where we belong because that's where it's been figured out, and we're staying there to the end, to the bitter end, right, or the happy end, God willing, right? And of course, that comes from Yisidasa B'Harei Kodesh, right? Because it used to be that the Rebbe would say your shlichus is here on the map. That's it.
And that story is partially true. There's a lot of shluchim, even in the 70s and 80s, that would say that they had to give the Rebbe multiple.
No, I'm saying in the beginning. In the beginning, it was very like, this is your place, take it or leave it, right? And there's something very nice about the certainty there. And even later, the shluchim that you're talking about that gave a number of places. Once the Rebbe said, "This is your place," that was your place, right? And what you're talking about is not just navigating the corporate structure or corporate ladder of shlichus, the hierarchy of shlichus. What you're talking about is letting shlichus find you.
Correct.
Right? And there's something, it's a very interesting question about shlichus, right? Like, and it really goes beyond the official capacity of shlichus, the official vocation of shlichus, right? Even if you're, let's say, a businessman.
Exactly, that's where I wanted to go. In other words, in any area of life, I would say every part of adulting.
They use that word in South Africa? How far do I have to travel from this country to get away from that?
Sorry, apologies.
That word's terrible. Yeah,
okay, anyways, part of that idea of becoming our own person is taking ownership, right? Taking balabatishkeit on our life and our decisions. And whether it's shlichus, whether it's our marriage, whether it's how we're raising our kids, we find a lot of comfort when we're younger in the script. People call it the system. I hate that word. There's a script.
Yes.
And whether you follow the script or don't follow the script, there's a very strong script. Obviously, once you're an adult, the script is still there. There's Shachas Minchamaydev, there's Limud HaTorah, whatever, right. There's Chassidus, but the script is much looser. There's a lot more hours of the day that you have to fill in the text your own.
Right.
And that idea of finding your own way in it is something that I think a lot of us resent. I was just talking to a younger man yesterday.
I have to interject with a story. But hold the thought. It's just too good.
Go for it.
I remember distinctly a classmate of mine remarking to me, I think it was like the first, he had, for some reason, I guess he had just gotten older or something, maybe you just finished yeshiva. It was the first stretch of a week that he had gotten up pre 6:30 a.m. for a week. And he's like, I Pashut didn't realize. This is a guy in his 20s. Pashut didn't realize how long a day is.
Pashut didn't realize how long a day is.
Like, a day goes on forever. He's like, I don't know what to do with myself. Like, there's a morning and afternoon.
Who would have known?
Who would have known?
Yeah. Yeah. I always joke that when I was in yeshiva, I wasn't a great Shem Master, and when I was in Shlichus, so it was a mashpia of Shalom Zalmanatik, and he wasn't impressed with my Shmer Sistarim, and he says, Levi, ich kann dir sagen ein Sach. Every bacher that doesn't take Shmer Sistarim seriously gets a job later on in life that he has to be up at 5 a.m. And I remember looking at him and saying, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Anyways, my minion every morning, 6 a.m.
You're up at 5 a.m.
5:30 latest, up in the morning. I have to say, and it's very fulfilling. But yeah,
and their yek is over there.
Yeah, like the rabbi walks in late, they're not impressed.
No.
And so like that journey of going on your own path is something that I think a lot of us struggled. And for me, the shlichus journey, it's my story, but I think it's a lot of stories. So there's other shluchim that guys my age that went on a similar journey, moved to a place, saw how they evolved. And I always say, even in South Africa, many of the shluchim, that what they're doing now is not necessarily what they moved down to do 30 years ago. They came down for one role and it evolved. That evolution of life versus the script of life is something that I find a lot of times we don't create space for. And we almost like resent the fact that life didn't set us up for that. And I'm not here to go to the system conversation, but I do believe there's a stage in life that has to be mostly scripted. Maybe they could do a better job of preparing, but mostly scripted. And then there's a stage of life where a person has to get the memo, and that is figure it out. I saw this letter came out today. I'm sorry for grabbing out my phone, but literally, so it was posted today, and it really struck a chord. This is Tafshin Tezayin, and the Rebbe is talking to the Tzir Agudas Chabad. Okay, go for it. Here's what the Rebbe says. When it comes to pulis and shetach in the area of Chabad, everyone's fighting with everybody, but everyone agrees on one thing, that everyone needs to be, the Yiddish word is piachetchen, like in other words, like massage the cheek, give him a hug, und einbetten and beg him, v'chulai haiva ulai, maybe at the end, yasa tova to the Rabbeim, val yadam l'kutcha b'chu, he'll do a favor to the Rabbeim and maybe through them to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he'll start thinking about how to do afayetzes mayanis chutza, etc. In other words, one of the hardest things that you see the Rebbe doing throughout Igros Kodesh and whatever in each one of our life is to take people and sit there saying agency,
right?
Take ownership and encourage people to take ownership. And I just want to give a gripe. One of the things that bothers me about so many of the narratives, it hasn't come across.
What makes you think that on this podcast we do gripes?
We're both accents. It hasn't come across on the podcast so much, but there's been a few. Is we live in an area today that the most powerful narrative you could give is compassion.
Right.
Rather than accountability, holding people accountable in a loving way, which whatever you could call loving accountability if you just want to give. And like that, I feel like it's a huge challenge of our time, and that is that it's all about compassion. Shame, you went through Gimel Tammuz. Like again, I could do an episode on my journey in Gimel Tammuz, but I don't want to. Right. And I have to say tribute to some of your episodes that have helped me in my own head work through some of that stuff. But it's compassion. Okay, Shame, you've been through so much, so hard. Chassidus Mantzufil, Chassidus demands so much, and like we've gone to the other extreme now, where a lot of the narratives throughout the YouTube, podcast world and speeches and various things is compassion, love, versus the greatest act of love, I believe, is to hold people accountable and sit there saying, I believe that you are capable of figuring life out. I believe that you can figure out shlichus. Yes, the system needs changes. Yes, we have to figure out this. Yes, we have to figure out, but stop feeling like such a victim. Make a world for yourself. We don't believe in socialism. We don't believe in communism, not only in terms of finances, but even in terms of the movement. So many of us often see Lubavitch as this, like, we almost crave a socialistic kind of narrative where basically there's this benevolent government that's making the decisions for you, which at some stage it doesn't work. at some stage, capitalism, and I'm using those words, but I mean that idea of taking agency on your life and sit there saying, okay, I can't sit there blaming the fact that me and my wife are not talking the same language because she had a different chinuch. I have to figure it out. I can't blame the fact that shlichus is not so easy and no one's calling me in kollel. I have to figure it out. That shift. Yes, we could talk about what the movement needs to do to help that, but I don't believe in movement change. Not that I don't believe in it. I think it's almost impossible. But to remind people there is something you could do. And I feel like that's not a narrative that's getting enough attention.
Yeah. I think I know what you're saying. This week's episode is brought to you by This World is a Garden, a new film and concert production by Yuvla Media. Based on the Rebbe's first talk, Bosi Lgani, the production tells the story of the Chabad vision lasting over 300 years, to see this world as God sees it, as His garden. Combining beautiful cinematography with a live performance of a string quartet, This World is a Garden is a meditation on hope and holding on to a vision as time passes by. This production is now available to be shown at your Chabad house and community. Share the message and vision of Bosi Lgani with your community in a way you never have before. For more information, please visit thisworldisagarden.com. The word script definitely feels appropriate, and I think to riff on that a bit further, you can think of it almost as, even in the script, there is the rehearsal. For a play, there's a rehearsal, or if it's sports, there's a rehearsal of a play that you draw up, and then there's the real
The game.
with the play. When the curtains come up and you have an audience and things go haywire. You don't know exactly. Things change. You cannot call timeout. There's an opponent in sports. There's an audience that's watching it and not going to give you that kind of grace that and that's when the magic happens, right? That's when the magic happens. And, my contention has been, I don't know if it's exactly what you're saying here, but my contention has been and still is that as much as it's necessary in yeshiva or in chinuch to ingrain a certain idea into students, and they're impressionable, they're young, they're not really ready for game time yet. The purpose is for game time, right? The coach is coaching his team for game time, right? The purpose is not the rehearsal. A team that's great at rehearsal but can't think on their feet and can't react to what's thrown at them is not going to be very good. They're going to
Famous expression, I'm sorry if I get it wrong, but some of the Rebbe Shab didn't trust the Bachrim. In other words, until you're a balabas,
right.
I don't know who you are.
Right. I never heard that. That's very interesting. And and I think, bring it back to Der Shvi, I think this has to be interrogated, because I don't think it's just simple. I don't think it's the right or wrong here is not so simple, but I think the narrative that's been crafted for Der Shvi is that it's all the Bachrim, right? The famous stories of hey Tevis, what the Bachrim going to say, and just the general kind of motif where the Bachrim, it's again started in the early Yuds, where the Bachrim were the ones that were right away gung ho.
The first ones to buy in.
They bought into the Rebbe's vision and the Rebbe's enthusiasm and just whole gang, and the older people were a lot more what's going on here, and set in their ways. And that immediately set up, look, you can blame it on this guy, the other guy, plenty of them are related to me, I get it, but anyway, I'm not guilty for them anyhow. They came before me, but I'm saying I'm familiar with a lot of those people.
But it created a divide.
But you could say they're bad, you could say they're good, you could say it's this guy, it's that guy. You could say whatever you want. The fact is that chasm or that schism came almost immediately. Bachrim versus the older Chassidim, right? And that is a divide that's persisted. The divide, and people you would think that once those Bachrim became the younger light, they would be fine with the new Bachrim, right? Because officially, supposedly, the whole idea was that the old guys didn't buy into the Rebbe's vision, and the young guys did, right? But once the young guys are the older guys, and the young guys and the older guys are both buying into the Rebbe's vision, everything's okay. No, it was not, right? Especially as the younger guys got older and older, it again became a schism, right? And certainly in the MEMS, where in the 80s, where the Bachrim and a lot of the first generation Shluchim who had been those Bachrim 30 years earlier,
Suddenly they're the establishment.
it wasn't just establishment. There was a schism again. It's not even so important to me to label one way or the other. It was just there was a schism, right? And what that does is that creates a separation between the rehearsal and game time, right? There's this. It becomes like the whole world. And I think another ingredient also is that because the world around the Rebbe was so rich and so saturated, which hadn't existed in previous times. For so many years of Lubavitch prior, the Rebbeim were away a lot. Right? This idea of like, B'chal, it wasn't the yeshiva until the Tenchet Tumim, and even by Tenchet Tumim, they didn't.
You didn't live with the Rebbe as much.
In good times, you saw him once a week for the Mimer. And that was it. There was no Fabringen. There were a few Fabringens. I don't even know if the Bachrim were invited to those Fabringens. I'm not so familiar. But Teres Shalom doesn't talk about this large. It doesn't seem like it's said in this large Fabringen. Here and there were a lot of times the Fabringens were the Bachrim themselves without the Rebbe shop, right? And like, so
which tells you what?
No, so what tells me is that you have, first of all, this persistent schism between the Bachrim and the older than Bachrim.
Correct.
And then on top of that, the Bachrim are in this world that is magnetic and has its own center of gravity, the Rebbe's world. And so they are
closer to the source.
Yes. They know what's cooking. They know what's cooking. The old fogies, even the ones that went on Shlichus and were the first ones to buy in, they're not updated.
They haven't gotten the most recent upload.
Yeah, what do you know? What do you know, right? And there's this kind of like the center of gravity shifts towards the Bachrim. Now, I'm not even here in this particular conversation trying to make a point whether it's a good thing or a bad thing.
Rather,
you could probably gather that I don't think it's a great thing, but I think one of the consequences of that is even if you're neutral on that happening in the first place, one of the consequences of it is that the rehearsal to game time continuum gets disrupted.
It's a backwards transition.
It gets disrupted, right? The idea of seeing Bachersha life as a prelude and solely a rehearsal towards real life is completely disrupted, right? Because instead what we have is when you're a Bacher, that was game time, and once you're married, you're that retired sports player who's now a has-been, and like, back in the gute Zeiten. And it's like, no, this is the game. That was a joke, right? That was a joke.
Yeah, that's part of the explanation.
I got carried away.
In other words, but I do think that when a person, I'm just going, my friends and I are going through the stage of 40,
right?
Which is a weird stage of life. And you're trying to make sense of the journey, and you realize that, yes, being a bacher is a magnificent time. And I don't think it's only a means to an end. Like, I work on a shul that's on a school campus, and often there's this slogan that goes around that says, children are the future. I always say, I find that problematic. I think the children are also the present and not just the future. So in other words, I do think the bacher shayarin is not just a means to an end. I do think it has inherent value.
Right.
It has value, even not what it leads to. But I do think that there is a big part of it, and that is to prepare the person and to give the person the fire, right? The famous mashal, that if you have a big fire, then later on you'll have a smaller fire. But it's a much more oris bekalim, whatever. It's the not that word that you don't like, but it's the maturation. It's going into becoming your own person. And I just find that so many of us, and so many of the conversations that many of us have, are griping about that transition instead of embracing it. Okay, in other words, like yes, they didn't prepare us, and yes, this, yes, that. But ultimately, in every society, at some stage, that movement from being a kid, a teenager, okay, in the secular world, you're then going to university. And at some stage, you get your graduation paper and you have to make it on your own. That transition, I work in a shul where pretty much that's the whole world. Everyone's getting degrees. That transition is hard. But that resentment to the transition is a bit baffling. In other words, it's a gift. Do you really want someone holding there by the hand for the rest of your life, rather than embrace the fact that at some stage, yes, no one's going to, very few people getting a phone call in Koil saying, we have a perfect shlichus for you and for your wife with the perfect salary in the perfect locale and everything's going to be taken care for you.
I'll take the other side of that.
Okay,
though.
please.
I'm
setting it up so that we can have the conversation.
I'll take the other side of that. I don't think that most people, that to me is a bit of a caricature. I don't think most people want to be led by their hand their whole life. Okay. I think there is an impulse of, when things get hard, you're like, I wish it was easier.
We vent.
But in fact, that's what I can't stand about the word adulting, because adulting implies that being an adult is something almost like this challenge that you have, when really it's a natural course of events. And so that's a flip side of, I wish I could be a child, but I have no choice. I have to be an adult. And it's like, no, I don't wish I could be a child. What are you, nuts? Why would I wish to be a child? Who wants to be a moron? Like, a child is an idiot by definition. Like, they don't know anything. Who wants to be a child, right? This idea that, like, I want to be a child, but there is that kind of mentality in society where people whenever it gets tough, they kind of, there's this language of weakness, which I agree with you that that's not a good thing.
Do you feel that that's a very strong narrative that's coming out? In other words, that when you listen to a lot of these speakers that are really, again, I don't want to be specific, a lot of these very popular speakers that are getting the message.
It's not a Lubavitch thing. It's a world.
Worldwide.
It's a world.
I'm not saying Lubavitch.
It's a world thing. It's a world thing.
We've gone extreme on the compassion versus accountability.
Okay, but I think so. I agree with you on that. What I would take the counter on here is that I don't think people really want that. I think people fall back to that because it's easy. I don't think people want that. I think most people want to grow up. Most people want at the end of the day, who are the heroes? You want to see what people really want. Look at who they look up to. They don't look up to the coddled person who never did anything in their life, or was taken care of by their father-in-law. Okay, nobody celebrates. There are people who say, "Oh, wouldn't that be cool if I married into money?" But nobody celebrates the guy who married into money. Nobody.
So what's the issue, Benzi?
Well, they celebrate the guy who was successful on his own, right? That's what they want to be.
How do you make sense of it?
Okay, so you talk about the world at large is a very big question. But I think the counter that I'm taking on is that you are placing it all on the individual to basically,
figure their life out.
To basically impart his will and take his will and put it on reality, right? Shape reality to his will. And you could say, okay, that's what being a person, a man is. This is what you want, make it happen. I think at least in Lubavitch's case, which I'm more familiar with, I think to ask someone to do that when they've also been educated not to do that is already playing a cruel game. I think there is importance of pointing out what's up with the system, not for the sake of abdicating agency and say, oh, well, it's the system's fault, so okay, now I have an excuse, I don't have to do anything about it. No, because again, I believe that people don't want it. So I'm not so concerned about excuses. I don't think people want it. I don't think most people are not satisfied when someone gives them justification. Most people want clarity. They want to feel that what they're thinking is not ludicrous. They don't want to be gaslit. Okay. They want to feel clarity, right? They want to feel clarity, and especially they want to feel moral clarity. Okay. Right. Okay. So when you have a community that basically says an educational direction that basically tells people that kabal, you're going to go to a place at the age of 22, 23, and that's going to be your place for the rest of your life, and it's all figured out for you, right? When that's the narrative, and that's how you've been taught, And now you say, well, wait, 1 second. You have to do opposite to that. Based on what? Based on what? Like, you
Okay,
have.
so can I counter that?
Of course you can counter it.
Okay. So first of all, yes, in case in any way my messaging didn't show compassion, and I mean that, I'm not being cynical. In other words, I do think the transition is hard. I do think, on the other hand, that when you look at the Rebbe's Torah, especially in the later years, but the truth is, from right from the beginning, from when the Rebbe says Bosi Lgani, right after that first sikha, right after he finishes, and he says, I'm not here to do the avodah for you. I'll take the yichaya, el yichya. You have to do the work for you till Ba'alois Chanun Aleph, which is famous sikha about Ba'alois Shetei Shaleves Elam Elah, where the Rebbe really explores it. To till Tatz Vasir Kent, to Liliv Atat Tzava. Fundamentally, the Rebbe was the way I see it is Mashiach comes when people take agency. Now, the fact that the system, certain fellows in the system, don't push that narrative, we could gripe, we could tiny, but I believe
it's not certain fellows. Come on.
No, and I mean it.
It's not certain fellows. You have to look. You could disagree with me, but my argument is not certain fellows. My argument is not that there are certain fellows. My argument is that structurally, this is how things are. And this is the issue for me, at least, with this idea of therapy, in the sense that you'll have a situation where one younger man after another has the same problem, to the point where it's clear that that's systemic. And instead of turning our eyes to what's the cause of this, why is this happening on a systemic level, we tell the individual to figure it out on their own. It's like, no, fix the problem.
So I hear you. So I'll be honest, and I do believe that there's incredible room for the conversation on system. And I do believe that that's been given a lot of platform, and it will be given platform. What I feel, again, maybe I'm not listening to every podcast. I'm not saying yours. Every share, what I feel like there's this like groupthink that's coming onto almost every share it's just an incredible amount of compassion, which I understand. In other words, having grown up in Gimel Tammuz and growing up in that Crown Heights, I needed the compassion.
You're talking about Lubavitch specifically?
Yeah, Lubavitch. The world, but specifically Lubavitch. There's an incredible amount of it's hard, validation. The system has let us down. Gimel Tammuz was a chaotic time. The Mashpiyim didn't necessarily prepare us. That narrative gets. So I'm not coming and saying that narrative is false. I just feel, and again, I put it this way: if I grew up today, with today's narratives, but with the circumstances I grew up with, which was chaotic, the world I grew up with today's narrative, I wouldn't be from today, because I would feel very validated in my journey of dropping everything, because that's and I don't think anyone's intending that. I'm not blaming anyone for intending, but when the narrative moves so much to where did the system go wrong, and the world of compassion, and I see you, and I needed that. I'll be honest, in my own journey, or healing, just like adulting, I don't like, but in my own journey of trying to find myself in this world, I needed it at some stage. But at this stage, and maybe because I'm at a different age of my life, and maybe other people at different ages, and they won't resonate with that, and that's fine. But I feel like at some stage, I wish someone could look at me in the eye and actually remind me how much agency I have, because I'm not hearing enough of that. So yes, the other narrative is important, but this narrative is not getting airtime.
But so my feeling, I hear what you're saying. My feeling is that the narrative hasn't changed at all fundamentally. It's all window dressing. It's all window dressing. At the core is a lack of trust.
Between who and who? Between
the older generation and the younger generation, right? So when you and I are growing up, there is this, I'm oversimplifying, obviously, but the older generation is panicking about what the younger generation is going to look like, because they're going to grow up after Gimel Tammuz. And so there's a deep lack of trust of the future, what's this younger generation going to do, what they're going to look like. And so you see this like locking down immediately, like, literally a couple months after Gimel Tammuz, white shirts in yeshiva only. Oh, what's that? What's that? Okay. What are you doing? Right? You're freaking out is what you're doing. Right? The guy with the yellow shirt or the striped shirt 2 minutes ago was fine, and now you're freaking out. Okay. Right? So you're
consolidating.
It's worse than consolidating. You're panicking is a word, right? And there's a lack of trust. And everybody that grew up in our times knows exactly what that lack of trust is, right? You anything that you said that was not exactly like was said 20 years earlier was knocked down as apicursis and hefkeris and we know better, they know better, they were by the Rebbe, you weren't. There's a lack of trust, and that lack of trust expresses itself in conformity. We're not going to trust you to do your own thing, so we're going to tell you exactly how to be. You're going to wear a white shirt every single day and only a white shirt. To the point of absurdity. I was once in the yeshiva, and I was visiting. I was ready. I think I was getting married. Whatever. I don't remember. I was ready a Chassenbach, I think. The timing doesn't work out. Anyway, I was at a yeshiva, and I hear the mashgiach making a new rule that he had been in the dormitories, and the bachrim were wearing colored boxers, and it's terrible le'aleinu, black and white boxers and tidy whities. What's that? What are you exactly? That is conformity. That's conformity to the nth degree, where you walk into the dorm of your yeshiva and you see bachrim expressing themselves, in the one place that they're allowed, which is a colorful boxer and your underwear, and you don't like it so it's conformity. It's all conformity all the way to the absurd degree. Now what you have is a flip. We still don't trust you to grow up. So now we're just going to shower you with we're going to say we can't trust you with agency, so we're just going to say that you don't have any. And it's not your fault.
Patronizing.
Yes. It's the same exact thing.
100%.
We don't trust. It's just window dressing.
I agree.
And both of those attitudes come from, in my opinion, fear. We are scared of what's going to happen, and we are scared.
So can I give you an example of that?
Of course.
It's a weird thing. I know it's going to trigger some vachim.
You don't have to ask any permission.
So I pretty much went to American yeshivas all my life, and besides 1 year. And American yeshiva farbrengens, I'm sure things have changed. I can only talk from my reality. I'm always reminded by my younger siblings that the reality I grew up in and the reality of today is different. I've been on my own side of the plantation for the last 15 years. But from all the farbrengens I ever sat on, here in America, I literally could not recall one farbrengen that someone actually spoke about life. And I landed in Eretz Yisrael. And the funny thing is, because I'm not a big fan of the Israeli mentality, in other words, whatever, the yeshivas, Chabad yeshivas in Israel. But the one thing I was a huge fan, I remember just sitting at the first farbrengen, and the guy's talking about life. He's talking about Nefesh Bahamas, and he's talking about a bacher growing up in this world and making sense of reality and context.
So what were they talking about in America? What were they?
Sichis and Kabbalah Soil and Heintus Yutas Kislev and Yutas Kislev is this
Rebbe
and that's what Mansich and Yutas Kislev is what's demanded,
right.
And that's the Avodah, and this is what we're going to do, and what's Tamayonis, and
right.
What did the Baal Shem Tov mean? Very much stay within the script.
Right.
And don't actually interpret the script. Don't
right.
give me any. And I remember just sitting there at the Israeli yeshiva the first time and saying, "This is Gan Eden. Right. This is Gan Eden. Someone's actually talking life."
Right.
In other words, I don't have to open up a lot of brachim. You suddenly discover the 7 habits or whatever thing that the guys type now. You could talk about life within a Chassidish framework, and that's what farbrengens are set up to do. The idea of, so I agree with you that interpretation and that preparation for life is, at least when I was growing up, was almost non-existent. And I validate that story. In other words, I validate the story, and I think it's an important story. And that when I was a bacher, and in the first few years after, whenever I would farbrengen with bachrim, I would try to give them that language. And I would try to create a validity of that narrative. That there's chassidus, and there's a way of interpreting chassidus, without the role of a mashpia, whatever. And at the same time, I just feel like the message has to be, I trust you enough to figure it out. In other words, I remember...
That's more than that. I trust you enough to make a mistake.
I understand. I trust you. That fundamental idea that, I'll give you an example. I often would, when I taught in high school, I would encourage the boys to go search, go find, discover Yiddishkeit. Rather search when you're home and your parents have...
South Africa.
In South Africa. Go search. I'm not saying search by you have to paint your hair green, but try to... And they would always counter and sit there saying, Rabbi, but what if I search and I discover it's false?
Right. I
said, I have enough trust that it's Moshe Emes to say that's Emes.
Right.
And I've literally made the deal with hundreds of kids over the years that if you go and search for real and you discover that Yiddishkeit's not real, come back to me, I'll give you $1,000. Now, not that I have the money,
Right.
but the point is, Baruch Hashem, so no one's ever approached me, and I don't know, hopefully they won't approach me, but that idea is, I truly believe that the story is true. I truly believe that the narrative is true. I truly believe that Moshe Amos was Sedas Emes, and that we're given enough to figure it out. We're given enough to figure it out. And that trust, one of the core of our conversation, the core of the conversation is the trust in people that they can figure it out, the trust that they can fail, the trust that they can take agency. The fundamental idea, you can figure this out, people. You can make a plan. You can figure out how to take the stuff you learned, the Maimarim you learned about Atzilus and Biyah, and you could figure out a way to interpret it in your life. You could figure out, if you want to go on shlichus, if that's your kav, you could figure out a shlichus for you. It might not be a straight route. It might be derech haruka k'tzara. You'll figure it out. You want to go in business, I'm Yechsidish younger man, you could figure it out. You want to raise children, obviously, Yakobi de Shamayim, in other words, Chutz Me'yer Shamayim, there's things that are not in your control, but there's a lot in your control. There's so much, other words, other than Hashgacha Pratis, number 2 is Bechira Chavshis. So there's Hashgacha Pratis, and right under that is Bechira Chavshis, the ability to remind people that you have choices, that you literally can make choices. If you're living in a place, and the place is not working for you, you can either change the place, you can move a place. Obviously, there's certain things about your life you can change. You're married, your kids, but fundamentally, this idea of just sitting back and griping. So going back to the word, while there is so much understanding, and yes, there's the point of the system, I do think there's room for the narrative to look at people in the eye in a loving way,
Right.
and sit there saying, "Man, you can do this. You can do this. It's hard. It's not pretty. It's a messy journey. You could do it."
Look, I'm all for the message. I just, I'm not. You're not talking to somebody who is. I don't believe in the therapeutic mindset, which is that everything needs to be made comfortable and everything has to be softened. I personally am fine with the message that you're talking about, but where I disagree is that at the end of the day, and this is what this podcast is really about, has always been about, is that we cannot present ourselves, we cannot present others, we cannot present our children with an option where the only way you can have an identity that's real and coherent and constructive, the only way you have that is by basically abandoning your collective identity, like your community's identity, right? And at the end of the day, we all have different layers of identity. Who I am as an individual, who I am as part of a family, who I am as part of a relationship, who I am as part of business, who I am as part of a community, right? Here, we're talking about who I am as an individual versus who I am as part of a community, right? And if the community and the structures of the community have created a systemic sense of distrust in our own selves and in each other, coming and telling people, buck up, you can do this, is not addressing the problem. In a way, it's exacerbating the problem. In a way, it's exacerbating the problem because you're telling the individual,
they're responsible for collective.
You're responsible for what was done to you, right? What was done to you? And
No. That's not fair.
I'm not saying that's what you're saying. I'm just saying that to me is the whole, right? The message I agree with. I'm not suggesting that that's what you that's what you intend to say, but what I see is that there's a gap there, right? There's a skip there, which is you are essentially telling the individual to abandon their fundamentals. No. We have to ask ourselves a question. Why is there a lack of trust in our community?
Listen, no one's denying
why is there a lack of trust?
No one's denying the world we grew up in, the trauma of Gimel Tammuz. But if you don't mind, let's go reverse. You mentioned at the beginning it
started well before Gimel
Tammuz. One second. So I want to zoom out even further.
Yeah.
I want to zoom to, you mentioned maybe we could just go to our grandparents' story. I want to go to that story because I think it has a lot of I'm not going to go through all the details, although it's a beautiful story. And I was begging you a few months ago if we could do a film together on it. Who knows?
I didn't refuse.
I know. Who knows? I said. So the Avtzon name, I often get in South Africa. Avtzon's the strangest sounding surname, last name. And
Strangest sounding surname.
For them in South Africa, I'm saying it's a very strange sound. Like, what does it mean? I always get the question, what does it mean?
What it means is a
What
good
it means?
question.
I'm saying, what does it mean?
There are some strange surnames out there.
Fair enough.
South Africa. Yeah.
And a few years ago, I tried to
just read the names of the national soccer team.
True story. But we started doing. I wanted to do research about Zaidi's family, where he came from, etc. Some was known, some wasn't known. And fundamentally, he grew up in a small little town in Ukraine called Mirgorod. And I'll start by the end. He ended up raising a family together with Bobby of 15 kids, and over 100 grandchildren, and many, many great-grandchildren. And the rest of his siblings were stuck behind the Soviet Union, and he didn't know they existed, and pretty much they didn't know he existed. And they all lived, none of them died in the war. They all lived into the 60s, 70s, and the last sister of his died in 93. By the time he discovered that he had siblings alive, it was 1999, 98, 99. At that stage, it was 2 years before he passed away, and they had all passed away. But literally, just before he was alive, he discovered that his siblings had all survived, and that his mother, who he named after in the 50s, had lived till the 60s. But how is it that a fellow that 6 siblings got stuck behind the Iron Curtain? I'm in contact with some of their descendants. There's almost nobody left. There's a dozen or two, some Jewish, some not. And how is it that he, Baruch Hashem, built an empire? What was the difference?
What's the difference?
He made a different choice. Okay, and fundamentally that was, and it's not unique to his story. I was talking with a relative of mine. They were telling me their grandfather's the same story. He was the only one that ended up from and came out of the former Soviet Union. In other words, at all stages, from the first generation of Chassidus, you know, the guy's being beaten up. You read the story of the Rashpatz, the way the Frierdiker Rebbe writes it. That idea of having to become a Chassid and being an independent player is at the core. It was from the beginning. And at some stage, it did become systemized. And I'm not saying the system doesn't serve a function and the collective doesn't serve a function. But we've gone so extreme to that, where your argument is now holding water, where your argument is coming and saying you can't blame the individual for the collective. But fundamentally, Chassidus was always an individual journey. The famous expression of the Frierdiker Rebbe, Teva habdidus ben bnei adam, it's good to be alone amongst people. It's a solitary journey amongst other people going on their own solitary journeys, with holding each other side by side rather than one person walking in front of you. And I do believe that journey, that narrative of what Chassidus is something that we do have to talk about. I'm not claiming that I have the answer, but I just don't feel like the stories of the Rashpatz and the stories of the first generation of Chassidim, Moshe Meislish, and all these fellows that came and had to fight their family and the etc. and go on this hero's journey to become closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu through the ways of Chassidus.
But that's because Chassidus used to be a hero's journey.
It still is.
No, but you see, but that's what I'm telling you. That's what I'm telling you. You cannot come and tell people that a chassid at once is conformity and a lack of trust in yourself. Okay, so
that story of that it's a horrible story. That story that when you go to visit a yeshiva and he starts telling them exactly what they have to wear. It's a very uncomfortable story.
Right. No, and so there's a lack of trust, and it goes all the way to that absurd extreme, and it goes in all kinds of other absurd places. And there's a lack of, and with girls and tznius, it's off the wall. It's nuts, right? And everybody knows it, but and so it's like. So then the question becomes, why? If everybody knows it, why are we doing it? Everybody's idiots. No, they're not idiots. Why is it happening?
There's a fundamental struggle that happens when you take a bunch of frum people and try to build a community of it. It's an issue that exists within Chabad, but it exists everywhere.
No, but we're talking about Lubavitch here.
I'm saying within Lubavitch, this idea, because Well, it happens. Once a person moves out, you live in a small little place. There's not that many Lubavitches around you. I live in my own little universe. That competitiveness of who's outdoing
That's not the
that's a
issue.
part of it.
Yeah, that's not the issue. The lack of trust in Lubavitch is what needs to be interrogated. The lack of trust, and this is a bunch of Stalinist, Soviet, we're communists, we're paranoid. I don't think that's what it is. I don't think that's what it is. I think, because why don't I think that's what it is? Because when you hear stories about the Chassidim in Russia who were under the Soviets, suffering under the Soviets, they trusted their kids more.
Yeah, I hear that. In other words,
so
the question, okay, so Benzi, why don't we trust?
Why don't we trust? And that's where you have to train your fire, because you could shout an individual from day till tomorrow.
But the truth is, we're saying the same thing. I'm asking, why don't I trust myself? And you're saying, why does the system not trust me? But fundamentally, you're putting it more on the system, and I'm putting it on the individual. But we're both saying the narrative that some stage there has to be a trust.
Well, you could tell an individual that they have to trust themselves, right? But then the question, if that's in opposition to the collective system and the culture and the collective that they're living in, then you're basically telling them to abandon that, right? You're telling them to become their own person and leave their home. And that's in general a question about Yiddishkeit. We always say, Avraham Avinu, Lech lecha mi'artzecha v'le'adcha beis avicha, right? And that's obviously, he has to leave Terach. Yeah, but if I'm learning it, my father's not Terach, and it still tells me, Lech lecha mi'artzecha v'le'adcha beis avicha, right? Mm-hmm. My father is a shliach. My grandfather's a Chassidish Yid. My father's a Chassidish Yid. What am I going to leave? Yeah, you have to. It's a course of, you have to. You cannot hold people in a grip. Time does not allow you to freeze things and say you're going to be exactly like me.
So Benzi, let me ask you a simple question. We're talking over here. What's the average demographic of people listening to this podcast?
But I have no idea.
On average, age group.
It's men between 25 and 45.
Okay,
but I'm not talking to individuals.
Why not?
Because this podcast is not about me telling people how to think. Mainly because I keep on changing my own mind what to think, right? Like I'm not like, I don't have like, okay, we go down to if you believe me or not, but it's irrelevant. I don't have this kind of, here's my philosophy, I must impart it to the world. Let me bring some people on the podcast to spice it up. No, the question is, why are we at where we're at, for good or for bad, right? There's so much good, there's so much beauty, so much reichkeit in our community, in our tradition, right? And the more, talking earlier about trusting students to go search, the more I search in Lubavitch, the more good I find. Okay, it's almost like you pick up a stone, you're going to find something beautiful. You may also find worms crawling there, but there'll be something beautiful too. It's all over the place.
And over 40 episodes, what have you found?
No, I'm saying, so how did we end up here, right? And one of the questions, really the first question is, where are we in the first place? Like, where are we? Right? Like, where are we? And then how did we end up here? And then one of the big questions is, now that it's apparent to me that there's this fundamental lack of trust, the question is, why did that happen? Right? Why is there a lack of trust in our community? Where did that come from? Is that like built into Lubavitch and Chabad, this lack of trust? Like, is that just part of the Rebbe Chassid model? Or is it something new? And if it's something new, where did it come from? I think it's entirely, I don't think it's built into the model. The whole idea of Chassidus Chabad is that you don't distrust yourself and place it all on the tzaddik. He trusts you, right? There is, it almost like it doesn't need to be said, but it needs to be said. It's so out in the open about how the entire project of Chassidus is to entrust and empower Chassidim with ideas. And
100%.
right. And your brother Shmuley was talking about this, where in his mind, the Shvi is entrusting Chassidim with something that up to this point had always been entrusted with tzaddikim and rebbeim, right? That's the ultimate of trust. And in my sense of it is that it came to a point, for one reason or another, where the trust became so enormous that to truly trust ourselves at that level was so scary and so daunting that we claim to trust, but we don't really trust. We don't trust ourselves to trust at that level. And so that language of trust became almost like a cover for a growing distrust, right? So we're saying that we're conquering the world, and the Rebbe, the famous Sachs line of like Rabbi Sachs line that the Rebbe didn't make followers, he made leaders. And then the ultimate irony, where like one time a year everybody parrots the same exact line, and it's like, which leaders repeat a line every single year about leaders? Like, that's not it's complete parody at this point, right? And we say that, and I think a lot of people believe that, but it's almost like a cover for what's going on underneath, which is a growing distrust. Like a growing distrust. Like, do we really have it in ourselves to do this? Right? And I think when you talk about 30 years after Gimel Tammuz, one of the ways of understanding it is this growing gap between the trust that we say that we have in ourselves, and look, Lubavitch slept, and growing, but then internally you speak and it's like, wait a second, do we have it? Do we have it? And one way that people would describe that is imposter syndrome, right? Where you present a certain way, but inside there's this festering doubt, right? And so that's one explanation. It's complicated. It's complicated. Trust in general is a hard thing.
Trust between who and who?
Well, to me, what I'm talking about here is mainly older generation, younger generation, but that's on a communal level. On a it plays out in different ways. There's the trust of the Hanhala to the Bachrim. There's a trust of a parent to a child. And then ultimately, there's a trust you have to yourself.
Fair, but I would say that just like the word trust that we're sitting on, also there's an idea of earned trust. In other words, I don't trust my 4-year-old to cross the street.
Of course.
Okay, so it's a complex thing. It's not just saying trust me. It's coming and saying I'm going to give you, hopefully through in the right way. I'll teach you values, and I'll teach you. I like the way Shais Taub one time put it: teach you how to think, not what to think.
But that's chinuch.
Okay, fine. And at some stage, then I trust you. And that transition, I 100%, like pretty much often, I don't trust you, and then I marry you off, and then of course I trust you. What do you mean? Like now you're on your own, and you'll figure it out. And
but I haven't trusted you at that point. Now I've forgotten about you.
That's what I'm saying. Whatever, and so of course, yeah, you'll figure it out. Like you're in Killen now, whatever. I'll give you a few $100 a month, but like I trust you to figure it out. And I agree, and that's why, having sat at many Farbrengens as the recipient, and at many Farbrengens trying to Farbrengen, for me, whoever's ever heard me Farbrengen, it's like I maybe I'm a broken telephone, and maybe I'm even wrong in it. But the narrative I always try to remind people is their journey. So yes, in other words, there is room, and we are doing it, and you're expressing the idea of like how we can get the system to change, and how do you convince a mashpia or an hala or parents to trust their kids. But fundamentally, it's each one. The parent has to believe in stop living with so much fear. And the child, stop imposing your fear. So I'll give you a mashal from a totally different world. So as I mentioned, I'm South Africa, and I'm a rabbi of a very, very secular community. People are like very much into their education. It's a more middle, upper class. And over there, the lack of trust manifests as if I don't push you to get your high school degree, and over there it's called a matric, right. Then it's like literally I'll invite a family for a Shabbos, and they'll say, sorry, Rabbi, my kid's in the matric year. All of us, like the house has to be like full on free zone. He's doing his matric. And then it's like he's going to university. And like at some stage, I'm like, if your kid doesn't want to do much of their life with their high school diploma, why I said, I grew up over here. I didn't have a high school diploma. My sister had a high school diploma. It was the most non-event ever. Over there, they put it in the newspaper every year at the beginning of January, all the marks of the kids, how many distinctions they got. So every culture creates the standard of what is considered success, and then everyone becomes the vanguards of how to hold that. Many people buy into this thing of being the vanguards of success, and at some stage it's like, no, trust your kids. That if it's their journey and you've given them the values and you've given them the love and the support and the encouragement and the agency, they'll make it. So yeah, for me that's an extremely important message to the parents amongst us, to the mechachim amongst us, is to explore in your own head, do you trust yourself? Do you trust them? And if you don't trust them, is it a block in your own head, or is it a certain skill that you haven't injected yet as a parent into your child so that you could trust? But the point is, the goal is to one day set them, they're going to stand on their own 2 feet, and they will make their mistakes, and they'll get it right. They'll figure this thing called life out to the best of their ability for their journey, because their journey is not your journey. HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends us all on different journeys, and even though you're the parent and you love your kid dearly, they're going to have to go on their own journey and trust the values. And if you didn't give them the values, then start giving them the values now, so that at some stage, let them fly. At some stage, let them fly.
Yeah.
No.
I agree with you. The problem is that, again, I come back to the thing, we're talking here about a systemic. It's structural. It's structural. So you are telling people to basically pick themselves up by the bootstraps, and that's fair. But to go back to your example of the world of getting a college degree, right? So yes, there is a noticeable in this country too, probably more than South Africa. There's a noticeable, and it's not Lubavitch. It's a world over. A noticeable uptick of parents more worried about their kids' chances, and the helicopter parents, and kids don't trust themselves, and professors are seeing more and more kids that are unwilling to suggest an answer if they're not 100% certain, and lack of confidence and so on. But a lot of that can only be fully understood when you look at a world or an economy where people have a harder and harder time getting started, right? And there are bigger forces at play, and there are. Meaning, it's easy to look at the individual behavior and say, what's wrong with this parent? What are they thinking, right? To me, the more interesting question is, why did they end up here? Because maybe this is a very naive kind of perspective, but my sense is whenever I talk to people on an individual level, they all want the same things. Yes, there are exceptions, but as a rule, they want their kids to be functional adults. They want to be functional adults. They want to have a fulfilled life, right? So let's go away from like education and growing up for a second. It comes to, let's say, healthy habits and healthy eating, right? And you're going to meet someone who is clearly unhealthy. He's overweight. You have to eat healthy. It's in your mind. It's in your mind, and it's up to you. That's true. But what it doesn't take into account is that one of the reasons why so many more people are overweight today than compared to, 60, 70 years ago, is a lot of the food supply is less healthy. There's also a lot more calories available to you in taste your ways. If you're a kosher eating Jew, you have much more snacks,
options,
right? And it's always in front of you. Like, I remember walking into an office once. I was working on a video project, and they're like, "Do you want a snack?" I'm like, I don't know, I was hungry. I'm like, maybe. And they open up like this room of snacks. It was like a from company. And the guy that opened it for me was, gesetzt. And it's like, if I worked in this office at a job sitting at a computer screen that I get bored at, I would look exactly like him, right? So you're telling him, control yourself, control yourself, control yourself. But there's an environment here at play that's making it harder and harder.
And your question is how to change the environment.
Right. It's not even, I'm not sitting here, it would be very appropriate for a conversation in a Crown Heights basement to let's fix the system.
But
I think even on an individual level, you have to first understand what you're up against. It's not just your mind. It's not just your willingness. In many ways, the will is there. People want to change. People want to grow up. what they're up against is also this narrative and structure that they've grown up in that tells them that that's the wrong thing to do.
Oh, 100%.
Okay, and so you have to start identifying what that is, and you have to start seeing, wait a second, is that actually correct? Is that actually correct? Is that actually something that I
So
need
let's
to hold
tackle
on
a
to?
few ideas.
But you see what I'm saying? Like that to me is why you cannot just settle at the kind of focusing and training on the individual. And I think
If I can remember when I was 20 years old, I remember saying, because whatever, I had my own interests, but I was still a white shirt kind of guy. Not that I have anything against colored shirts, but that's just whatever. And I remember saying,
you're colorblind. It's okay.
100%. I remember saying, based on the personality and interests I have, the only way people would help me make sense of me is if I put on a pink yarmulke. In other words, because then they're like, "Oh, he's alternative. He thinks on this other thing."
He's an artist.
He's an artist. And I was like, "No, it's like, why can't I be a black hat, black shirt? I mean, white shirt, black pants kind of guy, and still have a brain of my own?" But and you see that and understand. And again, I think things have changed, or maybe they haven't. But like I'm going back myself 20 years ago. I'm thinking to myself and saying,
But that's a perfect example, actually.
like, do you see me beyond the penguin outfit?
No, but it's a perfect example where you are asking now the individual to see you in a way that goes exactly opposite to how you're dressing. And the reason you're dressing that way is because your community, for whatever strange reason, right after Gimel Tammuz, decided that we're going to make the world black and white.
And it wasn't worth my time to fight it.
No. But I'm not blaming you.
Yeah.
But in this instance, you're asking someone to identify you opposite to how your intention may not be to be a conformist, but the way you're dressed is part of
Seems to be saying something.
It is saying something. Even if you're not saying it, it is saying something. It's saying that you're dressed like your community, which is all into conformity, right? And you just never you decided to non-conform or to be different in your mind as opposed to your clothes. It wasn't worth the hassle of buying new shirts.
Exactly.
Right? Fine.
Okay.
But why should someone make that assumption? The easier assumption and the obvious assumption. We all make a statement with the clothes that we're wearing. That's just inevitable. You could make a statement that you don't care about the clothes that you're wearing by wearing some washed out. You could make that statement too, but you're making a statement,
okay,
right? And the statement that you make when you wear a white shirt and black pants every single day is that you're not fighting conformity on this level. In other words, you're being a conformist on this level. It's not okay. That's what someone reads into it, and you're asking them to read into it more than they. And it's like,
I know, but at some stage, I evolved in my own thinking where I sat there saying, Levi, why are you waiting for other people to see? In other words,
no, I'm talking about the other person.
I get it.
It's a perfect example of like you're right and he's right. You're both right.
I know. And at some stage, instead of me resenting the fact that I wasn't seen, I just decided, okay, go on the journey. So all I'm saying is, systems by definition are created to take a lot of people. It's more sociological and psychological. It's about taking a lot of people and making sense of a community, and it's control, but it's not so much control. It's just a way of organizing the world in a structured way. What's in the community, what's out. Okay, and for some people it does work, and it used to work for a lot more people than it works now. When I was growing up, a lot of the guys didn't resent it. I think what happens is a lot of people start questioning it once they were married and in different space.
But Lubavitch was around for 300 years.
Yes.
How many years did this conformity model work for? On a community-wide level.
I'm scared to answer that question. I do.
You know the answer. It's 20 years.
No, it's longer.
No, it's not.
It was not longer in a consistent way. I do think that the Time Chitmim, the original. That's what I'm saying. That's a sliver of time.
But that was a niche of Lubavitch. That wasn't the community of Lubavitch. That was a niche. It was self-selecting top Bachrim from the entire world of Lubavitch around the country. A handful of Bachrim.
At the beginning, eventually it became more democratized.
But compared to the size of Lubavitch itself, like how big Lubavitch was. It was a handful. A lot of Bachrim were turned down, even to the end, right? Even to the end.
And most of them fell off.
And most of them didn't even show up in the first place.
I'm saying most of them have lost to history.
Yes, exactly. Right, exactly. So, like, you look at the times of the Alter Rebbe, there was a cheder or the two chadarim of the top.
And are you
chassidim.
suggesting that was a better system?
I said.
I'm suggesting. I'm not saying.
I think it was an anti-system. I don't think not anti. But
I get it.
It was a system that wasn't a system in the sense that, especially in the beginning, each chassid had his own protocol that the Alter Rebbe gave him. He would go work on his own for 10 years in his village and come
3
back.
years before the chassid.
That's
7
not a
years
system.
after.
That's the opposite of a system, right? And again, now I'm riffing. I'm not some kind of historian here, but maybe where the kind of idea of a system starts coming in is with the Tanya, and out there telling people that you should, you can. This is like a manual, but really, if you read the Akdama on a very simple level, what the Alter was saying is it's the opposite. Like this is a conversation starter, and you ought to be conversing with one another.
You, the book, and your mashpia.
Because if you're not conversing, forget it. It's game over. Like because again, Lubavitch cannot work on a manual. It's opposite. You cannot trust people if you give them a manual. Right? It's like if you're handy yourself or you hire a handyman, the first thing they do when they come to assemble something in your house is they throw out the manual. They're like, that's not for me. That's for idiots. And they have a point. Like somebody we're talking about rocket science here. We're building a cupboard. There's pieces of wood with nails. I'll figure it out, right? And usually the manual has stupid ideas anyhow because it's talking to idiots. Which, by the way, I'm one of those. I'm not handy. I'm just saying. I'm not looking down at anybody. I'm one of you. But my point is that like manuals are in many ways are fundamentally for people that don't know what they're doing, right? And so maybe that's where it started, but what never really took hold. Not to mention that, like maybe time itself. I think I don't have such good. I don't. But Lubavitch kept on splintering.
Let me ask you a simple question. People came. When you describe the Lubavitch Chinuch, are you describing it today? And I don't have the answer to that because I'm not in the system now. Are you describing it the world we grew up in, or the world that you know that your kids' age are going through?
Well, I didn't grow up in your world. I grew up in Hong Kong.
Fine, but at some stage, and you went to the yeshiva world.
I was never a conformist, but
yeshiva world, not your story. In other words, are you so sure that the system is as rigid and untrusting as it was? Because I'll be honest, when I talk to my brothers and talk to my nephews about the journeys they're on, I think that the worst is behind us.
So here's the thing. I'm not like if I wanted to talk about the system, I would talk to someone from the system. In
other words, a lot of what guys our age are struggling with is narratives we were told 15, 20 years ago. Okay, and then we basically moved to our own little corner of the planet and are trying to make sense of stories we were told and matching them to reality. So the question that you're really, I'm not answering. I'm trying to understand is: are we trying to explore the stories we grew up with, and are we trying to explore the stories that are still being told? Are we what are we exploring?
Right. So your question, in other words, the way I understand it is that am I talking about something that's basically irrelevant at this point?
No, or it's not irrelevant.
It's our problem, but not their problem.
Yes.
Okay. Look, I'm not. What I do know for certainty
because then the conversation changes.
Well, I do know for certainty that some would say yes, it's the same problem, if not worse, and some people would say no, it's gotten better. So I don't have enough knowledge to make my own decision. I know that I'll hear opinions of both ends.
In other words, for me, the value that I found in your podcast, again, and I'm a guy in a certain demographic and a certain age, which you mentioned is the majority of the listenership, is making sense of my own journey. In other words, it's not so much prescriptive of where we're going, and it's more we're here now. Like you always repeat the idea that time is something that just moves on. We're here now. However, we have a story of our past that has not been fully explored, and the fact is it's still affecting our present because we haven't made sense of it. Right. So if that's the conversation, it's a different conversation. It's an important conversation, but then the question is, what's the final message? In other words, what do you tell a guy that's 35, 40 years old?
Well, so to answer your first question, I certainly think that that there is a resonance that one around my age, I'm 36, so 10 years up, 10 years down, you will, in many ways, resonate with a lot of things that are being spoken about more than if you're a different age or a different gender, right? I mean, my wife has no idea what's going on here in the podcast. I mean, the historical one's very interesting, but like this kind of
Dribbling.
like trying to this untangling is like, okay, and I think that's healthy, but it's healthy to kind of to keep it to compartmentalize, but so there's certainly like resonance that every group of people within a certain age, they will resonate to something specifically that they can all kind of relate to, the time that they grew up in, the kind of the trends and so on. But the second thing that you mentioned, which is understanding where this came from, is relevant to more people, right? Because even if you came into the story earlier than me, meaning you're much older than me, chances are, if you're listening, you are young enough that you came from the same place, especially if we're talking about the older guests, right? Or we're talking historically, you came from there too. And if you're younger, you certainly came from there. Now, the question that you can ask is, did something happen in between our age and the people that are younger than us that changed everything fundamentally? Now, even if it did, it still came from the same place.
True.
It still came from the same place. Now, right. So a lot of the fundamentals are still there, right? So the question, unless you say that it's changed so drastically and so fundamentally that the fundamental issues and tensions that we're talking about no longer apply, I have very little reason to believe that such a fundamental change has happened. And the reason that I don't believe it's happened is because when I speak to people my age and older, the shift hasn't taken place. The one shift that
So
has
how
taken
could they educate their kids differently if
Right.
they're still in the narrative?
Yeah, the one shift that has taken place, which is what you spoke about earlier, is that the language is a lot softer. There's a lot more understanding. And now, I would give a caveat. One caveat I would give is that I think that, maybe it's two caveats, but I'll start with one, is that there is a power dynamic. I trace back to a story that was shared on the podcast by Rabbi Moshe Nu, and he was speaking about his grandfather, Rebbe Kluvgant, when he was, Moshe Nu was growing up in Australia, and at the time his parents didn't keep Chal Yisrael. Right, his parents were from Eden, but his mother came from a Lubavitch family, but his father did not, and there was also no Chal Yisrael to be had in Australia, so their family didn't keep Chal Yisrael. And his grandfather, who was a Chassidish Yid with the Weisse Bart, like one of the old timers, didn't say anything. And a way even more surprising was eventually when Moshe Nu came on his own accord they're always affiliated with Lubavitch, but became part of Bacher and joined the yeshiva and basically became a full-blown Lubavitcher Bacher. His grandfather never said, "Oh, finally." He was very stoic about the whole thing from beginning to end. And I can't read into his grandfather's mind. And he didn't. But to me, first of all, that's an example of trust. That's an example of trust. Okay? It'll figure itself out. That's number one. That's objectively true. But I think there's also just you can suggest into that story, and there are many stories like that, where at that time there was a handful of Chassidish Yidden in Australia. Just a handful. And so the chances of their grandkids being frum at all was already very low. So you take what you can get, right? There is a realistic part of ourselves that when we expect less, we're ready to make do with less, right? When our expectations are lower, we're happier with less too, right? And so there is, in that sense, there may be a fundamental shift in the sense that people today no longer assume or expect their kids to be frum the way they did when we were growing up. And so the older generation has had to basically come to terms with, if we press too hard, these kids are going to drop out. So we have to be more welcoming, and we don't have that kind of leverage that we used to have, where if you don't behave, we're gonna pot you, and then you're gonna come back for more. I remember when my wife and I got married, we were in Eretz Yisrael for a few months, and we overstayed our visa, and when we were leaving the country, the passport control, they look at our visa and like, you overstayed. I said, yeah, I'm sorry. So she says, when you come back, we'll scream at you. Right? You're going to come back and we'll scream at you. We came back and they didn't scream at us. But there was that mindset back in the day of where, we're gonna harass you and make you conform, and you're still gonna stay. But people don't stay anymore. So now the chinuch has had to kind of become softer because it's been forced to. They don't have that kind of leverage anymore. You understand what I'm saying? They don't have that kind of a grip.
I know, but that fine.
So in a way, that's a hopeful kind of change. Counterintuitively, that's a hopeful kind of change because it forces people to trust.
That's actually not trusting.
But it's a forced trust. It's not the real trust you want, but you take what you can get.
Yeah, but it's not It's not holding people accountable. It's basically saying I'm terrified of my kid.
No, but you have no choice but to trust now. You have no choice but to trust.
No, because what they're doing is just compassion and absolute non-judgmentalism without any holding them accountable.
Again, that's window dressing. But I agree with you that in that sense, nothing's changed. That's what I'm saying. The language changing doesn't make me feel any better. If that's what you're asking.
So let me.
But
let me suggest what I think has changed.
That component does make me feel better.
And again, I'm walking a bit blindly, but I do think you always talk about that the change, the big shift that needs to be explored is not so much Gimel Tammuz, it's the transition from the old world to the new world, right? It's a theme that you sit on. At the same time, there's no question that 40 years in the Rebbe's light, Shraga B'Tiara Mayahani, in other words, is a big bonfire, a small little match doesn't do much. And at least locally, I mentioned earlier about Israel, where I found a different journey, but locally, the people that were being mechanech on the most part, it wasn't for independence, it was for soldiers, for chayalim.
Right.
And that inevitably has to change when it's 30 years after Gimel Tammuz, because there's a limit how much you can hold onto the charisma and the shraga, the big flames. That's why I do believe that something is shifting, because when I see the Rebbe Sich of Tutals Vasser Kent, and like I mentioned earlier with Baal Eischa and Vetzich Neshek and Fegelach and Bozim and many other Sichos throughout the years, forgive me for putting words, I see a strong frustration, especially in the later years, where that was like, we set up a movement of people that could figure it out on themselves. Take out Shlichus, the famous story of Shlomo Zalman Hechter, whichever Hechter was, the Moshe Yitzchak Hechter that I sent you, and you have the capability to figure it out. And like, especially in the Nalef Numbezi, like, guys, like, the narrative and the mission was that you guys are going to bring Mashiach. So the Rebbe says, Tutals Vasekent, and everyone starts saying, Be'etzem, he could do it himself. But, and you're like, yes, there is a sikh where the Rebbe says that the Rebbe spoke about the Be'etzem, the Alter Rebbe took him, it could have not gone to prison, etc. But fundamentally, Mashiach has to come, friends, through Avodah B'Kerech Atzmai. In other words, we, individuals, bring Mashiach. The point is Dir B'Tachtonim. The point is not Dir B'Elyonim. The point is that the Rebbe has the Anshe Moshe that goes bring Mashiach. And even that statement somehow becomes controversial when I sometimes say it. Like, the plan always was that we're bringing it. The Rebbe is guiding us. The Rebbe is giving us the Mahalach. The Rebbe is giving us the Doida Shvi mandate. And he's giving us the intellectual and practical tools of how to do it. The moral the foundation of thought and practice. But fundamentally, we have to do the job. And that's why I'm saying I feel like the worst is hopefully behind us. That story that we grew up, I grew up in the Nuns and the early Samachs, those stories are much harder to hold on to, and inevitable, like you always say, time changes. I do think that there is something. Now, has it evolved?
But why have people suddenly come to the recognition?
Because you can't fight reality.
Oh, that's what I'm saying. Reality is
it's the best teacher.
Reality is a very hopeful thing, and to me that has been a more recent kind of recognition, which is, reality is something that is good for you.
It's the best thing.
Right. It's good. It's good. Reality is. And in a way, that's a famous Ma'amar Chazal of, like, you have to go to the Shefet Asher Yibba Yomim Ahem or something. Like, you want to talk about, if I lived in this time, there'd be somebody else, and I should go to if only I lived then, there would be a better leader. So there's a Gemara that you go to the Shafet in your times, not some other times. This is what it is. This is what it is. This is where you're meant to be. This is how. This is when you're meant to be. Deal with it, right? Otherwise, you're stuck in your own head.
I'm going to give you a personal example. So I went through a stage 5 years ago at my shlichus where I had a terrible break-in. I know every South African shlich, so I'm not going to go on that story, but I had a pretty nasty business. And then my father died suddenly a few months later, and then I dealt with a hectic suicide of a 19-year-old boy that pretty much made waves around town, and I had to officiate, whatever. It was a nasty business. And this all happened within 13, 14 months. And it hit me. That awareness, like, because I remember sitting griping with a friend of mine, like they really prepared me in yeshiva for this kind of stuff, like burying a 19-year-old suicide. And then within the next year, I was at 8 suicide funerals, not all of them in my kehillah, but I somehow became involved in a lot of these stories. And suddenly you're looking and sit there saying, yeah, they did prepare me, they didn't prepare me. Habibi, this is the world you're living in right now. And this is where you have to show up, and this is what you have to do. I mean, just literally a few weeks ago, I buried a 5-year-old kid. In the most devastating circumstances, and you suddenly I know I've come across harsh in this conversation on this topic. It's when I was 20, I was the griper at everything. In other words, I was the one that was like the kid in the black and white, shirt, begging everyone to sit, at least quietly, saying, "See me,
Right.
See me," And then I had to go on this journey. I moved to the other side of the world and find the shlichus in a unique way, and find a shul that's not a typical Chabad house. It's a very, it's its own together. And at some stage, I wake up and I realize, Levi, Hashem designed your life to be where you're at now. And stop to the saying, they did give me training, they didn't give me training. In other words, I agree with you that we have to go through that process of what led us, but the goal, that's what my crystallizing this conversation, the goal that we all have to reach to at some stage is HaKadosh Baruch Hu placed you where you are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and whatever chinuch you got, and whatever was done right, and whatever was done wrong in your chinuch, you are where you are. Hashem designed your steps, and now grab it and do something with this world, whatever world you're living in. And I'll be honest, like, I was the rabbi that when I showed up to the Rabbanus, I had a senior rabbi above me, and he was dealing with funerals, and I was relieved because I was the most awkward guy to do with shiva houses. I was the most awkward to do with death, and no idea. Unfortunately, now I had a lady walk over to me a little while ago in a shiva house and say, "Oh, you're the rabbi that does the deaths." Like, I show up to the Chevra Kaddish in Joburg, and like you again, you get all the crazy cases. I've literally gone from one extreme, being awkward, to literally having to sit. And most of it happened after my father's death and me finding meaning in that grief and somehow offering value to others. But the point is, at some stage in somebody's life, in all of our lives, you don't only accept reality, you embrace. And you see that whatever journeys and whatever Hashem placed me in the world I had to live. And for whatever reason, I grew up in the late Mems and Nuns and early Samachs, and I didn't have the mechachim I believe I needed. And I didn't have the journey that I would have designed for myself, and yet it brought me here. So yes, we can talk about designing a healthier system, but I do believe, and that's why I brought up the idea of capitalism, that at some stage in a person's career, if they really want to be an entrepreneur, if they really want to build something, if they want to make something in their life, they have to look and sit there saying, yes, I grew up in Mirgorod, and all my brothers are communists. I think Zaidi had an older brother that there's a bunch of versions that happened, but somehow he was killed in a very graphic way during World War I for being on the wrong side of the fence. At some stage, this is it.
Right.
And our Zaidi had to go through them, Bubby had to go through, and your grandparents on the other side, my grandparents on the other side. That agency, like, I'll say one more thing on that. During COVID, I spoke a lot about my grandparents. From both sides on the pulpit in the shul, and I remember one of the guys in the community was like the one that literally every community you need to have at least one guy that's there to push terrorize you. It's like, what's this rabbi just giving stories about his family? But like, for me, I got incredible chizuk when I think about the Mesiras Nefesh they had, when I think about how much that my other grandparents were able to raise a family of 13 kids in Moscow, Russia, stuck there after the Holocaust, after my grandfather losing every single family member in the Holocaust. He still, together with my grandmother, managed to raise a family of 13 kids. Baruch Hashem, I have over 1,000 descendants today. That like, and everything in the system was screwed up. Everything in his life was miserable. But he had that hero's journey that I just feel we need to talk about more. So yes, we have to respect the story of the narrative. But I do think, and I'm coming back to it, and I'm sounding like a broken telephone, but like, guys, I'm saying to me.
Now you sound like a mashpia.
No, and I'll be honest, on that, before I went on shlichus to yeshiva, and I spoke to a mashpia of mine, and he told me something, and it sounds silly, but I take it to heart. I said, how am I going to go for bring now? Went to yeshiva g'dayla with kids a year younger than me or my age. How am I going to do it? He said, talk to yourself out loud. I know it's often repeated. For me,
it works.
It works. In other words, I have to give a lot of shiurim and I have to do a lot of talking. That's pretty much my whole job. And like, you can't always talk about stuff that you're at. Because literally, whatever, your dad tzaddik nevesh b'hem, I'm not there. But if I'm only going to talk about exactly where I'm holding this moment and what my journey is, my speech is going to get very boring very soon.
It sounds like a podcast.
Yeah. So at some stage, you're like, okay, talk to yourself out loud. In other words, it's like, I'm not saying I've mastered the art of self-agency, but I'm resenting how little of it I'm hearing. How very few Farbrengens I'm showing up to or listening online for Yom Pagda is the mashpia coming and like, I want someone to man for me in a loving way, not like, you fared, you shtick garnished, who do you think you are? But I want someone to sit there saying, Levi, are you doing that? When was the last time you learned to sikh? Like, have you gone through the Torah this year? And not like this like patronizing, very bistu kind of guy. I want someone to demand. And I'll be honest, I've had a few mashpiyim in my life. And unfortunately, most of them I had to drop because at some stage I just felt like it was useless. Like, yeah. Schreibt zum Leben, yeah. Do a little achlata. And I'm like, a little achlata, I'm an adult. Can you push me a little harder? Like, push me. Tell me to do something with my life. I could do more. I know I could do more, but you're not telling me that. You're telling me, kleine achlata, one sikha once a month. Right. That's cute when the guy's literally, having a rifyon and like that's what. Right. But like you could. And that's what I'm saying. We've gone from one extreme where month to month, but of course we do it with guilt. And that's why, Barry's podcast resonated a lot with people, like the idea of the guilt that comes with the money. And then there's like, okay, so let's not money at all. Instead of saying, no, I see you. I see your incredible value. And I'm demanding of you. I'm demanding of you because you could do so much more. There's no reason you can't go through Likutei Sichos. There's no reason you can't go through Shas. There's no reason that you can't learn whatever it is that your skills are. There's no reason you can't go to take over a business and take it over. You can't go do a shlichus. You're made. Not everyone's made for it. But I see you as the individual. I see your koiches, and I believe in you. That belief. Like for me, when they talk about that made leaders, for me, it's the idea that I see you and I hold you accountable for the chushim that you have. You could do so much more. I'll be honest, for me, if I had a mashpia like that would see me, my Mailos Tanchesenis, and hold me to account, that would be a gift.
Yeah, how many mashpiyim see themselves that way, right? So, yeah, look, at the end of the day, in terms of if you're suggesting or we're talking about what's actually the way to fix the problem, yeah, if you're going to wait for the system to correct itself, you're going to be waiting a very long time, right? You're going to be waiting a very long time. So ultimately, the only solution that you have in your hands, right, is to essentially do it yourself. That's what you have in your hands. What you have in your hands, and that is yourself, right? And at some point, that's the decision they have to make. Are you going to? I think Rabbi Avtzon used to have this phrase like, "Do you want to be right or do you want to be smart?" Right? You want to win the argument and say, I was screwed and my chinuch wasn't the way it should have been, and therefore I have I win the argument. Okay, good for you. But now you're a loser.
I remember.
Now you're a loser. Or do you want to be? Do you want to get a? There's what's that?
I heard it once put it this way. I said, when you come to Shemayim, it's obviously not true, but it's a good imagery. I enjoy it. People who don't need excuses go straight to heaven.
Right.
People who don't have excuses go to hell.
Right.
But what do people who do have excuses do?
Right.
So the imagery the guy used, I forgot who I heard it from, is you go into this room and it's exactly like Gan Eden. Everything's perfect. The only thing is that you have to watch a screen every day for a few hours, which plays the life you could have had if you stopped having excuses and you took agency.
So it's hell.
And they say the screams that come from there are louder than hell.
Yeah.
Like that idea, like that. And I'll say more than that. I have a guy in my shul who's done very well financially. Whatever, and he one time told me something very profound. He says, look around this room. Every guy that's had that incredible atzlacha in their business has a chip on their shoulder. They have something to prove. And in other words, not guys that inherited money or had incredible money. Guys that mamish went from the bootstraps, have a chip on their shoulder. And when he told me that reframed something in my head. That instead of me coming and sit there saying, oh, I have a chip on the shoulder, my chinuch, my this, my that, instead of saying, Levi, that chip on the shoulder, let it be your driver. Let it, obviously, and I remember hearing it from Chaim Shalom Deitch when he said, I think he or somebody else came into the Rebbe for Yechidus, and he said, I have gaiva.
Right.
So the Rebbe said, use it like a horse to a carriage to let it move you where you want. And I remember the imagery he said was that if the bacher next to you is learning more than you, shumu shamayim, he's embarrassing you. In other words, use it. So this idea, like, yes, a lot of guys our age have this stuff they're working through, and we have to work it out. In other words, and I want to just say at this moment, I'm not trying to be patronizing, but I really appreciate a lot of what this podcast has given verbiage. It's given words to be able to express. It's given literally prose for me to make sense hearing other people's journey. At the same time, I would tell myself and tell all of us is like, at some stage, that chip on your shoulder, that imperfect chinuch, that messy Gimel Tammuz era, that mashpia, that I remember walking over to my mashpia once and I really was going through a tough time. And he says, Ich bin nicht dein mashpia, ich bin dein melamed chassidus. I'm not your mashpia, I'm your teacher chassidus. I'm not here to answer your question. Like for me, I was like, I finally mustered, I'm an Oli Teranik, finally mustered the courage to be vulnerable.
He doesn't trust himself.
I understand. But now I can make, I have totally, I could understand it, but at the time. But the point is like, guys, I could really do amazing stuff, even with that chip.
Look,
even with that unsolved business.
Look, at the end of the day, it's very possible that the ultimate answer to the problems of the system is the fact that there is a system in the first place, right? And that ultimately, the only way forward is to basically leave the system behind. It's a very drastic kind of idea. It's very radical. It has, it has its roots in Yiddishkeit, and
unpack that.
Yeah, look, my favorite entry in their Shemis, I think I mentioned it a couple times on the podcast, is the Rebbe basically breaks down a few Amar Chazal, and long story short, the nub of it is, and the Rebbe articulates it almost as a math equation. Like there's step 1, step 2, step 3. Basically, everything in this world is created by the Yivshir for a purpose. Everything, every moment, every encounter, everything is created for a purpose, right? It's not levatala. The way you coming into this circumstance decide if it's for a purpose or not is whether or not you utilize it for something of kedusha. The way you make this moment purposeful is by using it for something of kedusha, right? And so in that moment, the entire purpose that was created here, the entire purpose that God invested into this moment and this encounter, is entirely up to you. And so in that moment, it's just you, and I think there are underlines this a couple times, it's just you and the Eivishter alone. That's it. That's it. This entire creation that you're existing in, there's nobody else. There's nobody else, right? Everything comes down to this move that you make, and only you can make it, right? And so it's just you and God.
Correct.
Right? And
what do you take from that?
Well, I mean, that is an extremely radical idea in the sense that, And it goes so far that the Rebbe is like later on in the Shema, you can see the Rebbe is grappling with how does this account for the idea of I don't know if the word's Avzon, but other people. If you're in this world by yourself, right, then where do other people come in? And it's a whole pilpul there. It in other words, it's a philosophy of I don't want to try to give it a category, mainly because I don't really understand these categories properly, but it basically takes an individual and says, it's just you. It's just you, and forget about everything around you. Forget about the situation. Forget about the past. Forget about the surroundings. Forget about your chinuch. Right now, in this moment, right? It's a very subjective way of looking at life, right? And yeah, I mean,
my favorite part on that is about the holiest place on earth is Kodesh HaKodashim, and the holiest time is Yom Kippur, and the holiest person is the Kohen Gadol, and on Yom Kippur they went to the Kodesh HaKodashim, and it's a Chassidish Vart. I don't know where it comes from. I'm sure someone could say, but in many ways, the holiest place is where you're now. The holiest time is this moment, and the holiest person is you. In other words, where you are right now, in this moment, Basher Usham, and that where you're standing. So yes, there's room to go through and make sense of our past, and there's room to understand how we ended up where we are, and the conversation has to continue. At the same time, we also have to remember we are so not victims of it. We have a lot more agency than we were told we have.
Yeah, but okay, look,
it doesn't resonate with you.
No, I'm not disagreeing with you. I just don't believe that people disagree with that. I think everybody agrees with that. I think the language that bothers you and the therapeutic kind of, basically, the overflowing of therapeutic language, or at least that you feel is too much, I think is people trying to come to terms with this problem. And so one has to locate what the problem is, right? And if they are addressing the same problem, as long as a problem is diagnosed, it is a machli chatzarufo, right? If that's what everyone is agreeing on, I'm okay with it. I don't think they are. Is my point. I don't think they are. But to keep on, I don't think there's a lack of will there. Is my point. I think reality is very, very solid. I think people want to.
Bensi, if I was listening to the narrative today, and I'm not saying, I'm sure many people, or all people know this, but if I was listening to the narrative today that uses words addict, trauma, hectic childhood, overwhelmed, not coping, etc., etc. In other words, at some stage, even if deep down I know I have agency, I'm not convinced I do.
Look, it's a whole can of worms. In some cases, that language is appropriate.
Of course it is.
In many cases, it's not, right? And the argument is going to be, how often is it appropriate and how often is it not appropriate? And I mean, personally, yes, I am less on the kind of everything is therapeutic side. It doesn't resonate with me. But that's not the point here. The point here is not.
Why isn't it the point?
Because I mean, it's not. I can't say it's not the point. That it's a point that you're making. But to me, I don't think that's the debate. If you're talking to people who are listening to this podcast, I don't think the debate here, or the reason that people are talking about therapeutic stuff, is because they believe that everything needs to be now nice and soft like honey. Okay? We are trying to come to grips here with what does it mean to be a Lubavitcher? What does it mean to be a chassid? What does it mean to be a yid? Right? That on one hand is fully empowered and fully trusted, when everything we've been told kind of works in the opposite direction, right? And you're saying, well, just buck up and figure it out.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I'm not convinced that was the whole story. That was maybe the story that we understood, or that was the story that maybe someone must be focused on.
So that's what we're unpacking.
The Rebbe's narrative is much more complex than that.
So that's what we're unpacking. In other words, everybody agrees, I think, or most people agree, that we don't want to live in therapy La La Land. Maybe some people disagree, but I think most people, when you speak to them, they want, like I said earlier, sometimes they want to just be happy, whatever it takes. But really what people want is to feel accomplished, right? They want to feel accomplished, right? They want to feel like they made something of themselves. Most people that I know, most people, and I would hazard a guess that most people listening to this podcast are not looking for an easy way out. So what are they looking for? We're trying to understand this whole kind of like ball of string that's become our identity. Like, what exactly made it this way? Let's unravel it a little bit and understand how we got here in the first
Why
place.
they didn't trust us.
Yes. Why don't we trust ourselves? Why don't we trust ourselves? Why is it that 30 years after Gimel Tammuz and 70 plus years from Yud Shvat are we erst beginning to publicly talk about these ideas? Okay, it's not because I'm a genius, right? Why is this still, after a full year, and obviously resonating with people, why is this still the only conversation, public conversation on this topic, right? And people, that is a question that is being addressed in this podcast, and I think it's being addressed in general. I think that's a question that people are asking, is like, why are we so hesitant to think about these things? And at the same time, where does it go if we think about these things? Like, maybe there is a reason. Like, it's easy to say, oh, no, screw it, let's take the table and flip it over. No, maybe there's a reason why the table is the way it is, right? So it's a cautious, it's a careful, I don't know if the word is cautious, but it's a careful, hopefully respectful process of trying to understand why these things are the way they are. But I'm not at all convinced. I understand your frustration with a certain kind of language of, they were harsh and tough on you, so now let's be soft on you. But like I said, I believe that's window dressing. It's all covering up the underneath lack of trust, right? And so the key question is, why don't we trust ourselves? Why don't we trust ourselves?
And your answer to that is? Your suggestion?
No, I posited a few theories earlier. We're not going to get to the bottom of it now. We're not going to get to the bottom of it now. But I think really I don't, if somebody would say, look, you have 50 episodes, figure it out. And nobody told me that. So maybe it'll go for 300 episodes. I don't, I don't know that the question will ever be fully answered. Frankly, that's a bit of a cop-out possibly, but I don't think the question will ever be answered. I think ultimately we never fully understand why we are the way we are, and I think that's a good thing. I think it would be very boring if we understood all of that. I think the mystery is good. There's just endless kind of depth to probe, and history and psychology and just social everything, religious ideas. There's so many things to probe. And I think it could go on endlessly. But that in itself, to me, is a very worthwhile endeavor. That in itself, because reclaiming that process, reclaiming that discussion is part of giving yourself agency.
Okay, so let me make it very clear what I was trying to do and why I do believe it still has to be part of the conversation, because I love the push and take on this. I believe that telling people they have agency is not saying forget the narrative and focus on the agency. It's saying I believe that was the narrative always. In other words, I believe that if you would have to ask me what's one of the Rebbe's biggest frustrations based on the Sikh, especially in the later years, is the fact that people didn't take agency. In other words, something went wrong in that system of agency. The Rebbe Tafkid took, American boys who were technically, that's the American mentality, take over the world, that would send American boys to Israel, etc., and all over the world. And the Rebbe was there my father took over Sikhs in English at 20 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And 3 years later, the Rebbe, there was another Moshe that wanted to publish a sefer in English, and the Rebbe said, "Did they ask permission from Psichos in English to publish it?" And my father got drunk from L'chaim that night because the Rebbe trusts him to be the one that's achroi on. The Rebbe was an incredible trust. The shluchim, the head shluchim, the Rebbe sent out. All these guys were in their young 20s. The Rebbe was the ultimate truster.
Right.
And in yeshiva, many of us didn't hear it. Specifically, the mashpiyim we had. In other words, you boil it down, it's the farbringans we heard. Like, in other words, if you ask me, my father didn't trust me. I think my father was one of the most trusting fathers I can bless. Specifically, the mashpiyim, the farbringans kav was very much not that. In other words, for me, at least in my head, like when we talk about the system, it's like this, massive Illuminati. It's not. It's the story. No, I'm saying it's the stories that we heard.
Right.
And for whatever reason, the mashpiyim didn't choose to share those stories. And the point is, I do think that some of the other stories are being told. More of the other stories need to be told. It, like everything in life, it's a balance of a lot of stories. It's not a single narrative, and that's what my gripe with the therapeutic model is. Not that it doesn't have validity; it's that it's becoming a single narrative. It's becoming and obviously because of the pendulum swinging back and forth, we've gone from one extreme to the other. But the complexity of the narrative is what really I want to advocate for. That there is no single thing that needs to be said now. To create a human being that's a competent human being is multiple narratives working in tandem and creating this kind of mix that hopefully creates a functional, decent human being. I do think that a lot of the narrative we heard was valid. I don't think it was mixed in a healthy counterbalance and a multiple narratives. It was a very single narrative, and now we've gone to another single narrative. And if we could create a more complex narrative and not be afraid of multiple stories and trust, I could talk about back trust. I could mun from you, and I could give you the therapeutic, and I could sit there telling you, Kabbalah oil, and I could tell you that the Kabbalah of the oil is important itself, that you have to be Makabal the oil, Kabbalah oil. We often focus on the word oil, not Kabbalah. I could give you the whole alum of Chassidus, the multiple stories of different Nabeim and different Gufas, and together create a soup that gives a narrative that's healthy.
Yeah, there's nothing to disagree with that. Nothing to disagree with over there. Okay, at the end of the day, the trust boils down to, especially trust of yourself, boils down to being open to uncertainty. And uncertainty comes from a lack of so uncertainty comes from the fact that you're not hinged to one and only one way of looking at things. It like you said, complexity. There are competing ideas here. There are competing ideas. There are potential mistakes, right? That all leads to there are potential successes. That'll creates an environment of uncertainty, and ultimately, yes, it's up to us. It's up to each person. I can only speak for myself to allow themselves to allow themselves to have uncertainty, to allow themselves to open themselves up to uncertainty, and to different ideas and different possibilities. Uncertainty doesn't mean sfekis, like people make the mistake. Uncertainty means that it's an openness to different possibilities, right?
And not everything has to be resolved now.
No, nothing will be resolved now. Look, I was talking to somebody the other day. I forgot how it came up. Forgot the context of the conversation. Oh, he sent me a quote from some Russian author about how the goal of art is to present the problem and the questions, not necessarily to answer it. And I said, yeah, absolutely. Look, I think that's what Chassidus is also. Like, Chassidus is not so much. It's not so heavy on the answers. It's heavier on the questions. Like, the answers in a way are very pashut. Yeah, the Rebbe should create a world again to get over it. Like that's it. But what are the thousands of mamarim? It's the questions. It's the constant. But there's still a question. Still a question. Still a
Lama
question.
Yardan
Still,
Neshama Lamata.
still a question, right? It never gets resolved, right? So Chassidus is framing the questions, right? And talk about the therapeutic model. A lot of times you'll go online, and the way Chassidus is presented is we have all the answers. What's the point of having all the answers if you don't have the right questions? The right
And also, life is very boring when you have all the
but
answers.
it's not even the point. The right answers to the wrong questions are, by definition, the wrong answers. Right? You need to have the right questions, and the right questions I don't decide.
And I'll be honest, and
the right questions is,
in my opinion,
is the
it's
point.
a bigger accomplishment if through these conversations we allow ourselves to have questions, than rather if we could sit there answering what happened. In other words,
well, that's
permission to ask.
That's why I keep on telling you that you ask me like, what did I discover? I'm not going to give you an answer. Right? I'm not looking for that. I'm not even looking for the answer, to be honest with you. Like, what's the reason this and this happened? I'm not looking for the answer. There's no answer. There's no answer. There are theories, and then that theory gets questioned, and then there's a hole in the theory, and there's another theory.
Hypothesis.
And you have this idea, and then someone says, well, maybe not, and maybe there's another thing, and did you consider this? That's the point. Like, there's no answer. I'm not looking for an answer. Frankly, if there's an answer, I'm probably going to ignore it. Ibram Stopper is not ignoring it. I'm saying, I'd rather not know of the answer. I don't believe there is one.
And yet, the search is for the journey.
It's just fascinating. It's fascinating and so enriching to keep on probing the question. How deep does this question go? How rich does this question get? And with that, I'm happy. I'm not, like, what you're trying to do. You're trying to undo 50, 60 years of... No, because that would go against what we were discussing earlier. You and I and anybody else belongs in this place coming after however many years and however many mistakes that were made up to this point. That's what you have to believe, right? Our parents' generation screwed up, and their parents' generation screwed up, and the teachers were crap, and everything was a disaster. Yeah, okay, that's exactly how it was meant to be, right? But so what is it? So just man up and buck up and just make your own way. I feel like that's missing the point. So what am I saying? Figuring out figuring out what this problem was and what this problem is to me enough. Is to me enough.
Enough.
Yes.
It has to lead at some stage to agency.
That is the agency. The agency is the recognition. The agency is a recognition of I am able to understand where I am and why I am and how I am.
Therefore. And what do I do with it?
What do I do with it? Well, we all know what we ought to do. We all know what we ought to do, right? Like, what do I do with it? No. I think that in itself is an act of agency. Okay, so
that's where we'll agree to disagree.
That's not. Wait, 1 second. You say, well, put on tefillin in the morning.
No, I didn't say that.
No. That in itself to me is an act of agency where you are. I don't think that I need to. I don't think that agency necessarily has to be like. Everything before me was a mistake, or all this was a mistake. I'm going to revolutionize. I'm going to, basically destroy that and create my own future.
No, but the agency, at least the way I see it, is while working through it, not after. While working through it, I also counter it with the narrative instead of saying, as I'm gribbling and making sense of the past.
That will in itself liberate you to make your own choices, is my point.
I will remember the narrative that the Rebbe wants me to believe in, and that I believe life itself demands of me, is to show up to my life and make the best life possible.
But by asking the questions and by unpacking the past and by exploring the past and opening yourself up to what happened, what should have happened, what the rights, the wrongs, that complexity. That in itself, that act of agency allows you now to make your own choices. That is the first step. That is how you start. That is how you get there. Otherwise, what you're doing is you're just rebelling, and you're creating a rupture from the past, right? And in a way, that's also an act of cowardice, in my opinion, where you basically say, okay, it's all screwed up. I don't want to look at it. I don't want to confront it because because you're also scared that you might find out that you're wrong and they're right. So to me, the real agency is, this is who I am. And that's also the philosophy that you're talking about. If you want to believe that you belong in the place that you are right now, and that's where the Eibishter put you, he didn't just put you for the person you can become, he also put you for the person you are right now.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's all part of it. You have to be able to deal with all of it. Everything that came, everything that you don't like about it, everything that you do like about it, you have to be open to it. Right? And that act of agency, that act of trusting yourself to navigate it, allows you to move forward with it. Ultimately, moving forward, to me, that is an act of moving forward. That is an act of moving forward. It's a enriched, empowered way of moving forward, because you're not moving away. You're moving forward. Forward is with the past. You're moving forward with it. You're not stuck in it. You're not trapped in it. You're not moving backwards with it. You're moving forward with it. Otherwise, you're moving away. Anyway, that at least has been.
Okay, so I guess fundamentally, I mean, first of all, I think it's beautiful that you've articulated that way, because I think it's the first time in the episodes I've listened to that that I've understood from you what you're trying to do. Again, I'm saying for me, I can't. Maybe I'm slow and it clicked to me.
Am I trying to do this? Like, was that what I was setting out to do?
No, I'm saying now. This is where you're at. In other words, that the journey that you see the value in the journey of this exploration. Right, in the healing, in the unpacking, in the agent. That's the agency. In other words, that's the purpose. That's your mission statement.
Well, there's no question that starting out there was more a sense. If I had to guess where it was going to go, and I think a lot of people also made that assumption, and understandably so. It's like, if you're going to talk about this, you're talking about it as an outsider, as a critic, right? And in a way, when a system is seen only as conformist, then any kind of exploration of it, in a way, is inherently a critique, right? So if you're going to come and talk about identity like, I actually was invited on another podcast, and we don't talk. Like, I come to the podcast, we're going to talk about identity, and he's like, oh, that's been answered 6 years ago. Like, only narcissists and confused souls talk about identity, right? Which, if you don't let me explain myself, maybe it is, and maybe I am a narcissist and a confused soul, but like it's not a given. Like, it's not logically it's not a logical certainty, right? But I can understand why people would assume, in a fixed identity that's already been settled, you're coming and talking about it, you're just critiquing it and basically griping about it. And I think, and I, in a sense, I also kind of felt that, like, basically I'm just going to show people that, or I'm just going to kind of talk to people that are kind of on the outs, almost, kind of the outliers, and the people that don't fit in, the misfits. I'm going to have a podcast of misfits, and we're going to talk about
Misfits of the world unite.
Homesick for Lubavitch. We wish we could be there, but we were basically kicked out, and now we wish, right? And instead, what happened, and I would say it's pretty organic, and it's still a work in progress, right? Is that I realized that line of in and out is so much less stable. That line of, like, the people that are more like with the program, they're boring and, like, they don't think, and the people outside, they have all the wonderful ideas. And it's like, no. Talking, like, basically anybody with, like, anything in Lubavitch or any person that I speak to that's thoughtful, in, out, however you classify them, the question is not anymore, to me, like, are you in the system or out of it? Are you in that fixed identity or out of it? It's more like, what do you think about this identity? And if you think about it, there's bound to be something interesting there. there's bound to be something interesting there, right? And so what that did for me is that suddenly, you're having a conversation, like a conversation about something that, could feel so like in the box, and that itself could also be a very thoughtful conversation.
Correct.
You see what I'm saying? Like the split of in or out became a lot less solid for me, right? And so what I realized was, and what I'm realizing is that you don't have to, and this is maybe where I'm disagreeing with you. You don't have to create rupture to be your own man. You don't have to, the hero's journey very often is leave the, backwaters behind, leave the backwaters behind, the impoverished ghetto that you grew up in, go make a name for yourself in the city. And there's a truth to that, right? Like you have to leave the bosom of your mommy to become a man. It's just a fact, right? But it very often we mistake that with more like with like more objective kind of boundaries, geographical boundaries, like a white shirt, not white shirt kind of splits that are more like and it's a lot more complicated than that. To leave your childish thinking behind, you don't only have to talk to the misfits and the outcasts.
Correct.
You could talk to the people who maybe look like they're still very much part of it, but they've thought for themselves. And even if they haven't thought for themselves, maybe they have interesting ideas, right? And that in itself is reclaiming your agency. You're not necessarily leaving, right? So in a way, you could by finding agency, you're in a way becoming closer. Or by becoming closer, you're finding your agency, but you're doing it on your terms.
Yeah, I don't think we disagree. In other words, like, I was never advocating, let me just be clear, I was never advocating hero's journey as in break the system. I was saying I was advocating hero's journey as in at some stage live the life based on the chassidus that you learned, live the life that the Kadosh Baruch Hu wants you to live without so much resentment. But we basically agree. And what I loved about this conversation, as we're wrapping it up, is fundamentally we're saying the same thing from two different angles.
Which is terrible to agree. Very terrible.
That's terrible. Bensi, we're not allowed to agree on anything.
I'll edit that out. Because the only thing I edit out of this podcast is slander. And so that's...
So yeah, I think we all have to work through our journey and remember at the same time that Kadosh Baruch Hu placed us where we are, and we had the journey that was right for us. And we are exactly where we need to be at this moment, at this time. And the Eibishter chose right. Obviously, the Eibishter chose you and I to be in this place at this time, and this is where we belong.
Amen. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. The music for this podcast comes from the album Repentant Doors by Oren Sor Nadav Vachar and is used with their permission.